to us to keep the study where it was originally conceived. This study started in Arizona. It was, they tried to run us out of town, but we're going to keep it right in their backyard where they're most uncomfortable with it. We think that's the only victory for scientific freedom, is to show these folks that there was really nothing to be afraid of. There's a lot of fear around the word marijuana, that it's very politically radioactive, but when it comes to science, I'm hoping that fear, that we can get a handle on that and help people understand that this kind of science is important, regardless of what side you're on the marijuana debate, on the legalization debate. We are committed to collecting truly objective data and putting it all into the public domain. So we want to know the good and the bad of marijuana and put it all out for the public to scrutinize. So it doesn't matter where we do the study, it matters that we collect the most unassailable data that can actually be published in peer-reviewed medical journals, and that's what we're committed to.
I think it shows how far it's come along in such a short amount of time. Where does the rubber hit the road? What do you need now to get this study going? What's the next steps?
Well, I think hopefully this week we'll be signing a lease in Scottsdale. After a year of interviewing about 200 landlords and 4 or 5 different commercial realtors over the year, I think we finally found a property owner who's willing to allow us to do this. You'd be surprised that was one of the huge hurdles, because that's part of why I was fighting so hard to do the study at the University of Arizona, because not only because I was on faculty there, but because we had IRB approval from the U of A. So in 2012, the Institutional Review Board at the U of A approved our study with a lot of enthusiasm. But even with that, the U of A refused to find a home for this research on campus. And that was the problem we're dealing with, is that, typically university, or traditionally, historically, universities used to be a sanctuary for this kind of controversial work, this cutting edge research. But now they run away from it because it is so, like I said, because of how politically radioactive it is, they're worried about offending legislators who don't agree with this work. And so it's a really challenging situation. That's why it's taken us but we persevered and we finally found some property. So that was one huge obstacle, was identifying a simple home to do the work. And then the second challenge then is obtaining study drug. And we have no idea when that will happen. We can't even begin to screen veterans until we have study drug in hand and can actually then start finalize our IRB approval, begin recruiting vets, all of that. So that's what we're waiting on. Unfortunately, there's not much, with all the incredible support from the public, there's not much they can do except help us end the NIDA monopoly, and that way we can actually purchase study drug from any licensed grower. So, I'm sorry.
Kind of piggybacking off you the NIDA thing is, I guess my question is why the slow turnaround for getting the drugs, the study drugs, and do you think this that way by design?
Oh yeah, a lot of people think it's deliberate, and it's tough to know. I mean, I think what's happened is that NIDA unfortunately had no track record of growing marijuana that was rich in CBD until last year when we pushed them. When we got our final public health service approval in March of last year, suddenly the NIDA was forced to contend with the fact that they didn't have 2 of the strains that we were requesting. 2 out of the 4 were not available, and suddenly they had to learn to grow it. They never tried to grow CBD-rich marijuana, even with the immense interest in CBD only and all that. So I think that was the challenge, was that, but it's fascinating that there's so many growers right here in this state who already are experts in that and could have had it for us within months. And so I think there is some concern, especially among the veterans community. I think they're very suspicious. The government is deliberately dragging their feet, and it's understandable, because it's been 5 years since our initial FDA approval, and this study is still not underway. And one of the huge news, I don't know if you guys saw in the media a couple weeks ago, we managed, after 20 years, of begging to end the Public Health Service review, it finally happened. 2 weeks ago, Obama announced that he was ending the PHS review. That Public Health Service review delayed our study 3 years for no reason. It's a redundant review that happens after we obtain FDA approval. We have to go through and they have no timeline to conduct their review. They didn't require any protocol changes, nothing. And they just stonewalled the study. During that 3 years that our PHS review was underway, 24,000 veterans killed themselves in this country. And we wonder, could cannabis have been, have curbed this epidemic of veteran suicide? Yeah.
How do you get the schedule changed?
It's tough, and I want to make sure you guys know that by rescheduling the drug, you don't actually end the barriers to research. You do change the tone, the environment a bit, but rescheduling will not end the NIDA monopoly. That has to happen independently, and I want to make sure you know that Obama could end that NIDA monopoly with the stroke of a pen, just like he did with the Public Health Service review 2 weeks ago. He could do that. The Secretary of HHS, Secretary Burwell, could end that NIDA monopoly with administratively. None of them choose to do that. We were hoping, if you saw Obama, when he ended the Public Health Service review 2 weeks ago, he didn't receive any criticism. No Republicans attacked him for that. So we're hoping that maybe people see that as a door to possibly ending the NIDA monopoly so that we can enable marijuana research to finally move forward in this country, not just safety studies, but efficacy also. Yeah.
Like other vets, I'm skeptical, of NIDA.
Sure.
Okay, NIDA's gonna send you all of your study drugs, correct? We have no idea how that compares to any other drug on the market. Okay, now, and explain to me whole plant marijuana.
Right. That's what, it's basically what we get from NIDA is raw marijuana that's loose, it's already ground up, and it's sent in packages, giant packages in bulk to us. And then it used to be that they would roll it up into cigarettes, but their rolling machine is not working. So they have decided to ship it in bulk. So that's what we get.
Okay, but there's no stems, there's no seeds, it's fairly clean.
Well, not the pictures I've seen.
No.
The pictures we have of the rolled cigarettes that were shipped out in the last few years include stems, leaves. They basically throw the whole plant into the grinder. And so this has been interesting though. So NIDA just received a grant from NIH. They got $68 million to perpetuate this monopoly. And I'm hoping that with that money, that they might actually purchase a separator so that we can have a more pure, less of the supplementary plant material and more of the flowering plant, so we can actually, get because a lot of people in the medical community argue that having this sort of substandard study drug would sabotage your results from the beginning, and we're certainly concerned about that.
And we don't know what these people did to that product before they shipped it.
No, there's no transparency on that. All we get from them is the
Sanjay
cannabinoid
Gupta has
profile,
it
so
on
we
film.
No,
know.
we really don't have a profile.
Watch Weed 1, 2, and 3.
No, but what we intend to do is we're gonna work with the
Weed 3
DEA
covers
through
a lot of what
labs,
she's
but
talking about
probably
tonight.
the one at UC Denver. And we will be doing secondary testing on all the study drug that we get, so we can understand what beyond just the THC to CBD ratio, that's the only information we get from NIDA. 12% THC, 12% CBD, that kind of thing. But we don't know anything about the terpene profiles, we don't know anything about flavonoids, so we're gonna try to get a more comprehensive lab testing on what we receive and try to correlate that further.
And we don't know what process they use to
No,
process any of their
no,
product.
we don't, and so hopefully they'll become more transparent. There's so much public pressure on them now to start answering these questions that I'm hoping, but the best thing that would happen honestly is to just end the NIDA monopoly. They really, I hate to say, they don't deserve that monopoly. They have been, proven over and over again in these last 20 years that they're incompetent, and I hate to say it because our sponsor actually sued the DEA and won. The MAPS actually was able to prove to the DEA's own administrative law judge that this NIDA monopoly is a failure. that they have not been able to successfully produce all the strains that scientists have requested. So the DEA's own judge ordered the NIDA monopoly to be ended, and Michelle Leonhardt, who was the director of the DEA at that time, chose to ignore her own judge's recommendation and chose to maintain the monopoly, which was no surprise to any of us. The DEA is going to hold tight to that monopoly. They are not going to relinquish that unless they're ordered to do that by somebody on high. So it's going to be really challenging. Any of you who looked at the federal government legislation, the Senate bill called the CARES Act that was submitted by Rand Paul, that bill has a section in it that would end all of these ridiculous barriers to marijuana research, including the NIDA monopoly. Sadly, that bill is not going anywhere. It's stuck in the Judiciary Committee under Senator Grassley as the committee chair, and he's not allowing that to proceed. So I'm afraid that's gonna die soon. But at least it was the first effort that we've seen from the U.S. Senate to actually pass legislation, and to have a Republican as a primary sponsor was a big achievement. So yeah.
So what you're saying is it's politics and not science?
Right, I mean, that's what we've been, frustrated that science seems to be relentlessly trumped by politics when it comes to marijuana efficacy research. So I don't want to give people the impression there's no marijuana research, and there's tons of marijuana research funded by NIDA, supplied heavily with marijuana study drug by NIDA, looking at safety, right? Harmful side effects, addiction potential. Those studies get green lighted easily. So there's plenty of, when you talk to NIDA, they say, we're not blocking marijuana research. Here's 50 studies we're doing looking at marijuana, but if you look closely at them, you'll see that none of them are really efficacy studies until recently. Now they just put out an RFP to do a pain study, if you guys saw. That was exciting. So they're starting to embrace this idea that marijuana might actually have therapeutic potential. And so that's a good sign. So we'll see. Yeah.
So I get back to the study itself and the model, and I guess I'm a little bit confused as to the independent variables, because I understand the placebo effect. But how are you measuring those independent variables, and what are they? Is it binary, getting treatment or not? Is it based on dosage? Is it based on a different type? And how are you relating that to the dependent, those outcomes? And
Yeah.
I'm just confused as to, is it qualitative to quantitative to qualitative?
Right.
Those outcomes.
It is a very involved, I'm not sure if this group, but are you in this realm? Are you a researcher?
I'm an economics major.
Okay, because I was gonna say, I think I wanted to probably have a side discussion with you, and if you have time after, because that's a really important issue you're bringing out, but it's a little too involved, I'm afraid, for everybody, but I think it's important to address that, so thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask, with the intensive research that you would like to do, and yet the blanket, explosion of medical marijuana shots, so-called, based on what you said tonight, I'm wondering the people or the employees that work at these places who probably don't have a research background or any kind of medical savvy that they can work with folks that come in there for all of these various issues. Aside from the veterans, what's your your take on all of that, where they say it's safer and greener and it's all of those wonderful positive adjectives, but yet in light of what you told us tonight, how does that square with you? I mean, what do you think?
It's tough. I mean, I don't claim to have any, I can only tell you that the stories from these patients have been incredibly compelling, all corroborated by family members. Today we had a really intense, almost 3 hours at the Colorado Board of Health, where we got to hear, really persuasive testimony from one patient after another, many military vets talking about their experience with this plant. A lot of the scientists in this field say that marijuana is no more addictive than a cup of coffee. And the actual dependency rate that's been documented by NIDA and other agencies says that it's about 10 to 14% dependency rate with marijuana, which is still, far less than alcohol. So I will tell you, I struggle because for me, I look at cannabis and I say the toxicity of marijuana is remarkably low. It's much lower than most of the drugs that I prescribe to patients every day. And it's hard for me, I struggled for years to try to find legit treatments and combinations of meds that would work for PTSD. And it is tough because these meds are really imperfect. The FDA approved meds that I have at my fingertips are really disappointing in the end. And so what I saw, I was part of a system that would put these vets and other PTSD sufferers through the gauntlet of all these FDA approved meds, and nothing seemed to work, and they just got worse and worse and became suicidal. So, and then I spent some time in Canada and Israel recently, where I got to spend some incredible experiences with veterans who were picking up their marijuana from the government. And so I was in these marijuana distribution clinics with vets in both Canada and Israel, who would not only get safe legal access to lab-tested marijuana, but they were getting it paid for by the government. And so we recently had a chance to meet with the folks at the DEA and Office of National Drug Policy Control, and they asked us about the study and how they could help expedite. So after 5 years of stonewalling the study, suddenly they're asking how they can help, which is great. You know, we're happy that they're coming on board now. But one of the things that I talked to them about is, what about just looking as a harm reduction technique, and the notion that so many of those vets, for instance, end up getting strung out on mega dosages of opioids and benzos and things like that. And that's why I think that these governments, so, you know, I was asking them, because when I talked to the US government folks, they said, well, we can't possibly do something like that, like what Canada and Israel do, because there's not enough science. And I said, well, that's interesting that Canada and Israel, are you saying that these governments are reckless? That by you know, not just providing legal access, but subsidizing the medicine, that they're being negligent? And, you know, no comment, but I would say that it is really surprising when you look at the suicide rates in those two countries of vets in Canada and Israel compared to the US. I mean, we have a very serious public health crisis here when it comes to veterans killing themselves. And what's scary is that 22 a day is actually a very low estimate. I'm wearing this thing because even though they put 22 on here because it's already a horrific number, but it's actually low. I mean, this is a data that came from not all 50 states. So some of the bigger states were left out of this data collection. But the other important thing is I've lost a lot of veterans in my practice over 20 years to suicide. But all of those vets were labeled, all of the veteran deaths were labeled as accidents. Because generally, the coroner's office does not go the distance to really uncover what happened. But I knew, you know, when a veteran drives a motorcycle into a barricade at 100 miles an hour, and I know that that veteran has been actively suicidal for years, I know what happened. And even if they get labeled an accident, I know that that was a suicide. So this number is low, but it's already, I mean, it destroys me to think that our government, rather than expediting this study and making it a priority, they have stonewalled this at every turn. And I'm hoping that, you know, someday we are going to persevere until the study finally gets implemented. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for coming to shelter. My father's a Vietnam veteran, and I think we owe our veterans the best research when it comes to their health. And so I'm all for researching this product at the highest standard. My question to you is, you're talking and using words like efficacy and rigor and control, right? And with an industry with a multiplicity of venues of selling this product without any of those things. So what you're saying is, we want a highly controlled study to prove the efficacy of this product for medical use, a psychoactive, and yet an industry that will not be under that purview. And I have real concerns with that. I am for medical use that's determined to be helpful. Right. But I think the cart is definitely before the horse on marijuana when it comes to medical uses in the state and frankly in the country. So I appreciate your research. I hope it does give us evidence, but I think it's a little too late for what we're seeing in our community. And I'd like to get your perspective if you can find an FDA-approved form of treatment. What happens to all the marijuana dispensaries who sell it with no rigor, no research, no dosaging, none of that?
Right, no. It's a very legitimate concern, and I understand that there are a lot of people in this community that have expressed similar concerns. They support research, but they're worried about this, you know, industry running rampant. The good news is, so we already have one study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal. I don't know if you guys have seen that. Dr. Greer out of New Mexico published an observational study, but compelling enough to get it through peer review. We looked at 80 veterans who were utilizing the New Mexico medical marijuana program and used the CAP scale, the clinician, the gold standard for measuring severity of PTSD, and he documented a 75% reduction in severity of PTSD. And so when that study came out last year, it really reaffirmed our commitment to get our study done, because we saw that it's clear that we're on the right track. And I think that I recognize, I mean, believe me, I know that you're worried about what's happening in the industry, and it's very, how to say, it's tough to, I don't know how to say this, but I would say one of the things that I look at when I'm understanding the safety of cannabis is I look at poison center data, for instance, which is a very imperfect measurement tool. But in Arizona, for instance, we've had medical marijuana law in Arizona now for 5 years. So our poison centers get about 65,000 calls a year. And even since we've approved medical marijuana law, we still only run under 100 calls a year are even related to marijuana, and they're very benign reports like I feel dizzy or I feel nauseous. They're things that are often short-lived, that are very limited. So that's been a big relief to me to see that as I mentioned earlier, the toxicity of this plant seems to be remarkably low. But I don't discount, I recognize that there are a lot of, I'm a lifelong Republican, so I am a very strong conservative, and I've wrestled with this in the same way. I'm worried about edibles and pediatric exposures, and I'm highly concerned about that. But I still think overall that this plant is probably less toxic than most of the prescription drugs that I give to people every day. And we still don't have an LD50 for this drug. So there still has never been confirmed a lethal dose. I recognize that there are a lot of people who are arguing that there have been deaths associated with marijuana, but we still haven't proven that marijuana alone as a single, as a sole perpetrator caused an overdose fatality. So I don't know, I'm sure there are other folks out there who share your concern, but fortunately, there are a lot of people in the industry who are hearing this, and I know that they're very sensitive to what you're saying. And the good news is that I think Colorado is starting to lead the way in terms of responsible packaging, labeling, so now hopefully we'll be able to prevent a lot of the pediatric exposures and things like that.
Already have.
And I understand what you're saying, and I understand that there's the toxin and some of the drugs that you're talking about, and the pills, the prescription drugs.